The candle at the far end of the great room sputtered, making the carved bedpost swim in and out of shadow, as if the furniture itself were breathing. The air tasted of boiled sugar and old tobacco, a metallic hint beneath that like cold iron. And the floorboards carried the damp smell of river mist that had seeped into the house all night. She was pushed forward before she could steady herself, the linen of her gown rough beneath fingers that did not ask and eyes that did not meet hers. Lucia, 22, slave of the Engenho, felt the seam of the world tear along the hem of her dress, and knew in the hollow of her ribs that something irreversible had been given away. In the bed, the man who would become the new señor slept with the slur of wine and thunder in his breath, unaware of the price being written into flesh beneath him. Colonel Augusto Carvalho was the household in human form. His name alone opened doors and closed mouths, and the system that allowed the violence seated itself behind his smile, and in the ledger books where people were counted like sacks of cane. The discovery of a small folded letter hidden in the seam of a sewing chest would make clear who had been placed in Lucia's stead that night, and will reveal decisions made in corners that few suspect. If you stay until the end, you will see how a single scrap of paper can topple an arrangement of power, and how the price paid was measured not just in coin, but in broken lives. What would you have done if the choice before you was silence or ruin for those you loved? 3 months before that night, the Engenho rose like a low brown beast from the flat land where the cane grew in ranks as patient as armies. The mill turned at dawn and at dusk, the great iron teeth creaking, the smell of crushed stalks a living blanket that clung to skin and hair. Men and women came from houses of packed earth and from the distant senzala to be counted at roll call, to eat watery rice, to carry the loads that kept the sugar white and the ledgers fuller. The river ran warm and slow below the property, and the town beyond the plantation offered a notary, a chapel, and gossip that traveled faster than any courier. There were roughly 100 souls tied to the estate, the inventory and the master's ledger listing names, ages, trades, and values. Weather had been unkind that winter, and the harvest had been lean, which sharpened the faces in the dining room and tightened the bargains struck in the parlor. In this narrower economy, small cruelties pressed harder, and alliances formed in the shadows of the Casa Grande, where the señá measured reputations as carefully as she measured sugar for the pantry. The muenda groaned with labor, the tulla filled and was emptied, the casks were sealed and opened, and everyday details carried the weight of the whole system. The air of the plantation was always filled with work noise, the rhythm of pestles, the slap of leather, the quiet counting of coins, and an undercurrent of prayer and ritual whispered in the night by those who still remembered other names for the world. Lucia had been born beneath the rafters of the old Kanzala and learned to mend as she learned to keep time with the syrup pots. Her hands were small and quick, and her laugh came sometimes like sun through cracked roof tiles. She had a scar on her left thumb where a piece of cane had split under her palm when she was 12, and that scar had the strange memory of pain and survival braided into it. She had been the one sent by Tia Rosa, the curandera, to fetch herbs in the mangrove, because she could move unseen along the riverbank and could bargain with the fishermen without lowering her eyes. At 15, she had been chosen to stitch the bridal trousseau for Dona Isabella, the mistress, who had married the colonel 6 seasons ago, and who kept a ledger of gratitude that was more about praise than mercy. Lucia knew faces and voices, and the timing of work and of quiet. She knew the smell of cassava, the squeak of the sacks, the places where secrets liked to sit in the dark. She remembered her mother, an almost whispered presence, who sang songs of ocean at the washing trough, and taught Lucia that the world had listening stones. But there was another memory that sharpened when men raised their hands and when the sky broke. At 10, she had watched her father sold, at the Pelurino, sold because a wager and a debt had been placed ahead of his life. That memory was a small fire that she carried like a coal and warmed her hands on it when the nights were cruel. She hoped one day to gather the small savings she sewed into seams to buy her brother's freedom, but money moved through the plantation like water through fingers. These paragraphs repeat small details as talismans, so the reader feels the texture of how a life like hers was built from labor, loyalty, and a guarded hope. In the Casa Grande, the hierarchy showed itself in the layers of tablecloth and in who was allowed the inner parlor. Colonel Augusto Carvalho was broad-faced and polite with strangers, his voice oily with courtesy when money was discussed, but clipped and public when orders were required. Dona Isabella, the Seña, moved as if the house were her private map of rights and wrongs. She arranged flowers and reputations with equal care, and had a ledger of faults that she updated in the silence of her embroidery. Their only son, Manuel, was thin and lazy, and liked to sleep into Bjorn noon, because the estate's wealth cushioned his recklessness. Joachim, the Fator, supervised the fields with a wooden stick that had marks on it as stories the cane knew, and he watched the workers as if they were letters he was decoding. Tia Rosa, the curandera, moved between houses with bowls and a steady gaze, and knew more family lines than the priest, and she would later be pivotal. João Pequeno, who ran a small quilombo across the river, had been a companion to many, and his name was whispered like possibility by those who thought of leaving. There were other actors: Elena, the seamstress, who kept the sewing chest; Pedro, the millwright, who knew the machinery's complaints; Mateos, the boy who delivered messages and who saw more than he was supposed to; and Father Ricardo, the chapel's priest, who read leniently at Mass, yet turned his head in the moments that mattered. Each person carried a role, and each name would come to move the plot forward. Plans were folded like linens in the weeks before the wedding. Lucia served at the luncheon. The room smelled of rosewater and fried fish, and practical jokes were whispered behind hands. In the parlor, Donna Isabella received visitors and measured the worth of alliances with glances she sharpened into prompts. The plan to stage a substitution in the bridal chamber was not conceived in a moment. It was a ledger entry translated into bodies. On a humid afternoon, 60 days before the night, a meeting took place in the servants' corridor, a cramped space warmed by the body heat of those who had toiled. The dialogue stretched and tightened with careful exhales. Donna Isabella said softly, "We cannot risk the lineage. Manuel must produce an heir that is beyond question." Lucia replied, "I do not understand what you ask." Donna Isabella, "My girl, you will do as you are told and think of your family." Lucy, "My family has nothing." Joachim interjected, "It is for the house, the plantation comes first." Tia Rosa murmured, "There is a cost, and the spirits watch." Manuel laughed, "You will not be missed in the morning." Lucia shook, "Who will keep my brother then?" Donna Isabella, "We will make provision for him, a small pouch for travel." Lucia, "A pouch cannot buy a man's life." Donna Isabella, "Speak less and do more, or speak loudly and lose more." Pedro the millwright leaned in, "There are ways to make it clean and quick." Helena whispered, "The chest is ready and sewn with a false seam." Mateos, "I will hide the note if required." Joachim, "Make sure no one hears. There will be watchers at the back door." Those exchanges were brusque and layered with the smell of starch and sweat. The scene held 6 senses at least: the shiver of wood, the distant squeal of the moenda, the metallic scent from the ledger ink, the tang of citrus the Seña kept for the guests, and the bitter aftertaste of the colonel's cachacha. The conspirators spoke in clipped sentences, peppered with long pauses and stares that did more work than words. The conspiracy was not only a plan, but a social contract, the terms of which were enforced by fear and by favors. A short procedural aside explains how a substitution would be arranged. The mistress would feign illness, a servant would be placed to attend, and the room's curtains would be closed while the bed was prepared. A folded letter would be hidden in a seam to record the order. Only those at the top knew how to orchestrate such deceit. and the ledger would be altered to show a night of celebration rather than violation. This procedure required timing, stealth, and the complicity of several named workers, each step precise and methodical. On the wedding night, rain tapped against the shutters like a nervous percussion. The house smelled of hot wax and perfume, and something metallic beneath, like a warning. The guests had been fed and drunk, and the colonel had a look in his eye, the kind that meant business and amusement in equal measure. Lucia, dressed in a borrowed camisole, Lucia of the Sensala, had been instructed to enter the bedchamber at the appointed moment and take the place of the mistress, whose fainting had been practiced as though it were a role. The scene of substitution played out with suffocating intimacy, described without explicit detail, but with sensory weight. The fabric of the gown rustled against skin. Breath met breath, heavy and wrong. A chair scraped across the floor like a small animal startled. There were minimal words in the bed, a few murmurs of instruction, and the occasional grunt from sleep and drink. Yet the violence of the exchange was in the traction of hands, the tug of garments, the way Lucia's shoulder blade remembered a previous slap. A servant in the doorway whispered, "It is done, master," and a small folded paper was pushed quietly into the seam of a wooden chest, like a witness left to rot. Later, the colonel slept, his breath deep, and the house settled with the thud of satisfied possession. The morning after, a hush moved like a net across workspaces. Lucia moved among the other laborers with 100 small panes closing like traps in her. In the tulha, the scent of fermentation tasted different each time she dipped a finger into the vat. She remembered the weight of the colonel's hand and the salt that came with it. Within 2 weeks, her belly pronounced itself in a way that could not easily be hidden. The first conversation where the possibility of pregnancy was named occurred between Lucia and Tia Rosa in the back of the laundry shed, where herbs hung and the air was damp with boiled linen. Lucia said, "Tia, my stomach is wrong." Tia Rosa touched and hummed. "The child is not yet certain." "A life grows, Lucia. They will bury me or sell me if they know, Tia Rosa. Then we will move with care. There are remedies to soften things and options to outwit laws," Lucia asked. "Options like what, Tia Rosa?" "We will speak softly to the river and to ocean and to the old ways and listen for the safe path." There were symptoms, nausea and the alteration of how she perceived food. The smell of cassava bread, which once was comfort, became too loud. In the fields, her hands trembled when the wind was high, and at night she dreamt of the Pelourinho where her father had been tied. Rumors began to travel like rats along the rafters. Pieces of gossip slipped into kitchens and into the ears of the small and the large. Manuel noticed the change in Lucia's gait and made a joke that curdled into threat. Dona Isabella paced with a careful face while her ledger of household trouble accumulated names. The colonel shrugged and forgot details when it was convenient, but he kept his own suspicions behind the eyes of a man unused to being obstructed. The letters appeared as a possibility of revelation one afternoon when Helena, the seamstress, went to fetch a lining from the old sewing chest to mend a sleeve, and found tucked in the false hem a small folded scrap of paper with handwriting she recognized as Manuel's, a scrawl of concern and command, a note to the housekeeper directing a swap. Helena did not keep it to herself. She crossed the yard and showed Tia Rosa. Then the paper moved from hand to hand and finally into the grip of Joaquim, the Fator, who read it like a contract and felt the unintended sting of complicity. The paper brimmed with proof explicit enough to indict those above and threaten the future of many. The question for the conspirators became what to do with material evidence in a world where the law favored the owner and paper could be both an instrument of power and of destruction. A short procedural explanation clarifies that the local notary would register births and marriages, and that charges of impropriety could lead to fines or to expulsion, yet rarely to criminal punishment for members of the elite. Those in power could reshape records. The procedure of tampering involved bribing clerks, altering parish registers, and presenting false testimonies, all acts that required money, influence, and the complicity of clerical hands. Conversations multiplied the way stormwater divides and feeds streams. A meeting in the kitchen became confrontation. The scene is shown in detail with extended dialogue. Joachim slammed the table. This cannot be buried in silence, not now, when names sit in ink. Dona Isabella lowered her voice. We are protecting the house. What is your loyalty to the plantation, Lucia? My loyalty is to my child and to my brother. Manuel sneered. Your child will be a stain or a coin, whatever suits.
Tia Rosa, there are paths that do not end in the market. The river listens, and João Pequeno knows the way. Helena, we cannot burn a house. We need steadier plans. Pedro, I can make a place in the mill where notes vanish for a while. Mateus, I will take messages to the town if you need a face to bear witness. Father Ricardo, the church will not harbor lies, but it will plead for mercy. João Pequeno, if we must cross the river, I will take the child and guard him with the quilombo. Joaquim, so you offer defiance? This will be treason to some. Dona Isabella, think of the plantation, think of your families. Lucia, and who thinks of me? Each line carried gestures, a hand clutched a cup, set down too hard, a foot tapping the dirt. The tension built like a rope pulled taut and ready to snap. In the midst of these exchanges, plans were made to either hide the letter or to use it as leverage. The CTA to viewers appears here in a gentle break of narrative voice and asks a direct question in a voice of empathy. If this scene made you uneasy, you are not alone. Many historic stories carry this pain. In the place of Lucia, would you have hidden the letter or taken it to the town hall? Begin your reply with, I would have, so others can see the choices. People's comments help keep memory alive. Now, the story goes back 3 months to show how power arranged the night already told. As the pregnancy advanced, the house grew colder for Lucia. She was given tasks that kept her away from prying eyes, but not away from certain men whose presence was a threat in itself. The Fator watched. The colonel drifted through the verandas with a glass. Manuel prowled the corners like an animal sensing difference. A small scene of confrontation in the back parlor shows a longer exchange, 10 to 14 turns. Lucia, why do you look at me like an accusation? Manuel, you were in the bed? Did you forget already? Lucia, I was following orders. Manuel laughed. Orders from whom? From your own cunning? Lucia, I obeyed because I had no other choice. Manuel, choice is for those with pedigree. Lucia, my son will have no pedigree, only a name. Manuel, names can be buried if the owner so chooses. Helena stepped in. You speak cruel, Manuel. Manuel, I speak true, and truth cuts like a knife. Joachim, enough. I will not have threats near the work. Tia Rosa, threats sit in blood more than in words. Dona Isabella, return to your work, Lucia, and do not stain us with talk. Lucia lowered her eyes. Then I will be silent. The senses in this scene are heavy. The dust that rises when a foot stirs, the stale smell of candle smoke, the bitter of the colonel's brandy, the fabric of Manuel.
The house's coat rough beneath his hand, the taste of iron at the back of Lucia's mouth when she swallows fear. The dialogue is long and breathy and uses interruptions and gestures described explicitly so the listener can see how pain and power are negotiated. As the time of birth approached, clandestine activity increased. Tia Rosa taught Lucia how to prepare herbs to ease labor and to remember which prayers to speak in such a way that the spirits would look kindly on a child expected under shame. A technical passage describes midwifery of the era in precise 250 to 350 characters each time. Used this one explains a particular medicinal process. Tia Rosa boiled cashew leaves and applied a poultice of neem and pepper to tone the womb, and used the smoke of dried rosemary to calm nerves, a method part herbal, part ritual, rooted in African and local practices that were common among field healers. The labor began in the night, again the house shuddering with wind, and the moenda, a distant drum emulating heartbeats. The scene of birth is rendered with care for non-graphic language, focusing on sensation and moral stakes rather than physical detail. There was a low mattress in the curanderas hut, and Tia Rosa hummed and rocked and invoked names of river saints. Lucia pushed, and a sound came from her that matched the groan of the mill and the quiet prayers from outside. At one point, a shout indicated discovery, and footsteps thundered. The conspirators had planned extraction, a rope smuggled beneath the skirts, a basket waiting at a dock. But that night the plan misfired. The colonel's men unexpectedly inspected the riverbank, and the path became a gauntlet. A series of rapid exchanges drives tension. "Joachim, they are coming. The patrols are here." "Mateus, I can lead them wrong for a while." "João Pequeno, I will meet you at the downstream bend." "Elena, hurry, the child is frail." Tia Rosa pressed the baby to Lucia. "Go, run, go with him now." Lucia, "My child." Tia Rosa, "Your child will speak of survival, not of our failure." Manuel appeared. "Where do you think you go?" Lucia turned. "To where we can breathe." Manuel lunged. "You cannot take what is ours." Joachim blocked him. "No, you cannot take a child into wrath." Donna Isabella, "Stop this bloodless theater. Hand him over or pay the price." João Pequeno's voice from the dark, "Leave the child and you will answer for it." The clash became physical, without graphic detail, but with consequence. Chairs overturned, a lantern smashed, a cry that cut the night. Shots were fired, meaning a rifle discharged, the sound stark like a bell. People fell, names were cursed, and in the swirl a child was slipped beneath a shawl and moved into the waiting canoe. The price was brutal, as the title promised. Someone named Mateus took a bullet in the leg and bled under a leaf, while the canoe plunged away. The cost was counted in bodies in the market value lost, and in the long ache of families left behind. In the immediate aftermath, the house responded as houses do, with procedure and damage control. There was an accounting of missing persons and an official story of a runaway that fit the ledger. The colonel paid a policeman, and the notary signed statements. The church recorded nothing certain. But even as the public record closed, a private reckoning opened among those who remained. Tia Rosa was arrested briefly and questioned, and then quietly released with a warning and a small fine. Joachim was reprimanded and then rewarded at dinner because the plantation needed cohesion. Helena hid the letter, and when interrogated, she recited a practiced falsehood and wove tears into it. A procedural note explains how the police of a nearby town operated. They recorded statements, took bribes, and rarely challenged the landed elite. And the legal steps required for an investigation included notarized depositions, visits to the parish priest, and an oath sworn in front of witnesses, all easily manipulated by the wealthy. Grief and guilt braided the lives of those left in the Engenho. Lucia went slightly mute and walked with a stooped resilience that made older women nod and young children laugh in confusion. The colonel's household closed ranks, and yet the plantation could not be returned entirely to the way it had been. The loss of labor in a time of lean harvests was felt in the Tula and in account books.
The quiet rebellion of small kindnesses began a reweaving of community. Juan Pequeño's Colombo child grew and learned names of land and song, and the child's presence there was a seed of future danger and hope. The climax of the story arrives with a public confrontation at the small chapel, when Manuel, drunk and insolent, sought to assert the house's narrative and was met by testimonies that would not be bought. The chapel smelled of wax and damp stone, and the congregation gathered like a jury. Tia Rosa arranged for witnesses to step forward and for the curandera's knowledge of birth signs to be recited in such a truthful manner that even the priest winced. The hidden letter made its way into hands that were willing to make it public. A brave man named Mateos, though wounded, summoned courage and presented the scrap, revealing the instruction to substitute. The exchange in the chapel is long and layered. Father Ricardo began, "This is a house of God, not a place for blood." Manuel sneered, "You know nothing of pedigree or of consequence." Mateos held the paper. "Those commanded the substitution. Your hand wrote this." Joachim, "You will ruin us. You will break the house." Helena, "Will you let murder be the price of a name?" Donna Isabella, "I will not be shamed in public." Juan Pequeño, "Justice needs neither title nor coin." Tia Rosa, "The spirits know."
And the people will remember Colonel Augusto rose. "The law is mine to interpret, Mateus. The law remembers those who keep accounts, not those who keep souls." A murmur ran the congregation. Who will you believe, a colonel or a mother? The testimony forced a reckoning. The crowd leaned toward the evidence, even as the colonel attempted to buy silence. A small riot began outside the chapel. Some called for arrest, some for mercy. The Fator tried to calm man and woman, while children collected coins that fell from pockets like apology. In the swirl, Manuel pushed Mateus, and a scuffle broke out. People shouted names and shame, and finally the colonel lost face in front of men who had long held it as their shelter. The consequences were immediate for some and gradual for others. Manuel was publicly humiliated and sent away to the barracks in Recife, a cheap exile. Donna Isabella's embroidery never again looked like innocence, and she withdrew into a quieter shell that stitched a new ledger of remorse. The colonel faced a scandal that cut at the root of his authority, and while law favored him, practical power slipped in ways that would be felt for seasons. The plantation's profit fell as buyers asked questions and shipments were delayed, a much smaller but not negligible consequence. More importantly, the people of the Engenho changed their modes of speech and their notions of what was possible. The epilogue moves in time and is counted in 3 measures: 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months after the events. 1 month later, Lucia was distant and small, but the child that had been hidden grew in a Quilombo, where Juan Pequeño and his people taught the child the names of both son and spirit, and called him by a new name that belonged to no ledger. Letters still whispered in drawers, and Helena was given a sack of rice and a quiet job by the river for her trouble, and Mateus recovered slowly from his wound, his leg scar a permanent reminder of the price he paid. The plantation paid fines and the colonel kept his title, but with less easy smile. The community began to speak more openly about such things, though always with attentive silence when strangers were near. This first month was measured in small changes, the end of an immediate threat and the beginning of a new mapping of fear. 3 months on, the Quilombo had grown, with other runaways joining and forming a small but sturdy community that traded honey and fish with the town and told stories at night of resistance. Lucia visited once in the secrecy of dusk and saw her child safe among dances and names of ancestors. Tia Rosa was heralded and scolded in turns. She set up a small house of herbs and began to teach other women the ways of midwifery and herbal medicine. The plantation continued to function, but with quieter cruelty and more discretion.
The legal world continued to favor landowners, yet the small local council began to ask questions and to press for better records, a change facilitated by those who understood the power of paper. 6 months later, the child walked and sang, and the Quilombo had a small school where children learned to read with stolen scrapbooks and to write names that would not be for sale. News from Recife brought word of debates in the press about the treatment of enslaved people, about the law of the land, and of a slow-growing scrutiny. The colonel's fortunes wavered and his creditors whispered, while the plantation's accounts were thinned and some buyers looked elsewhere. Dona Isabella left the house for a small pension paid by a mercantile cousin, but she died twice in the memory before she ever left, once in reputation and once in spirit. Lucia made a small journey to the river every month to leave an offering and to whisper thanks and curses in equal measure. The legacy of that night carried like a scent. It stuck in mattresses, in ledgers, and in the mouths of children who would ask why some names hurt more than others. In closure, the story recognizes that while a scrap of paper exposed a secret, it did not erase the system that allowed such things. The plantation economy continued, and laws lagged behind. Small acts of courage changed trajectories, but did not produce full repair. Memory persisted, in songs, in the Quilombo's tales, in the rhythm of a seamstress needle that stitched not only cloth, but history. If you were moved by this episode, consider following for more narratives that unearth voices erased by ledgers and silence. Your subscription helps keep these stories alive and builds a space where memory meets research. The final picture rests on a river at dawn, where a child hums a song of two lands, where a seam of linen hides a small paper that no longer has the power it once had, and where the unquiet of a house grande is tempered by the quiet courage of those who refused to be accounted for as property. Freedom, when it arrives, does not erase the past. It demands that past be remembered.